How are you, David?
I'm good. How are you?
Good to see you. Good to see you. So, Olympian.
Yeah.
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 It's
Sometimes people say former Olympian.
how's that sit with you?
Once Olympian, always Olympian.
Yeah, that's good champion stuff, isn't it? Huh? Good fighting talk. Tell me this: you trained for a 4-year Olympics.
Yeah.
How many times?
Oh, just the once,
Oh,
unfortunately.
was it?
Yeah.
Oh, always
yeah.
Olympian.
Always an Olympian. Yeah. Well, it's like it's one of these things. I think success is never a straight line, as people used to always say to me. And you kick it all off, and you have that dream as a little kid. That one day you'll go to the Olympic Games. And for me, it happened in Beijing, 2008. And I always remember Beijing, 4 years later, London, and then go on to Rio, and then I'll retire after Rio as a 3-time Olympian. And unfortunately, I only made one. So, sport, high performance, it's managing yourself physically and mentally. And unfortunately, as I got a little bit older, the body began to kind of break down and kind of scream at me a little bit. And unfortunately, through injury, I didn't make London. And then I was retired by the time Rio came around. So, it's like I said, it's never a straight line.
I always say you're an all-time Olympian. So David, tell me this. So we've just come off the back of a 5-year lead up to the last Olympics, the first time ever in history. And we're talking about resilience, we're talking about burnout, we're talking about well-being. Our speaker, again, is a common kind of friend of both of ours, I think. Kerwin, who again would have been high performance here, would have worked with Gary Keegan, who's speaking later on, went to New Zealand. He spoke for us last year on the Virtual Talent Summit with Billy Walsh. One of his athletes committed suicide.
Yeah.
And there's a big debate going on in the world of high performance sport right now around how much is too much. And again, I think we just come off the back of this 5-year sprint. Equally, we've been through this extended period. The last 2 years, we know all about that. What's your sense of sustaining that over the longer term and the impact, and do we have it right or wrong?
Yeah, it's a really important conversation because we've seen it across world sports. Naomi Osaka in tennis, dealing with that kind of like the pressure that comes with a performance. You mentioned Tokyo was a 5-year lead in, so an Olympic cycle is generally 4 years. And obviously with the pandemic, things have been postponed. It became a 5-year, literally overnight. It's a 5-year cycle. And to kind of paint the picture, like when you're in that world of Olympics, everything revolves around the Olympic Games. So even like 4 years, when you're starting off your whole preparation, let's say in my experience for Beijing, it's starting like 4 years prior to that. And every day, every week, every month, every year is mapped out. Because you're always building towards a major championship, be it Europeans, Worlds, and then obviously in the Olympic Games. So the way you kind of work it is, you'd periodise your training. This is where the whole kind of strategy would come in. So your work, it can differ from different events, but in my experience over 400 metres, it's a periodisation of 3 weeks, 1 week, kind of less intensity, and then you build again. And you constantly focus on that over the course of the 11 months of the year. So again, from a goal perspective, it's not focusing in on that long-term goal, which might take place in the summer, which is 8-9 months down the road. You're focusing on that 3 weeks. And it's a great way of just kind of shortening things and just keeping it in the middle of the now, okay? So then it goes to year 4, and you're like, right, Olympics qualification. You got to qualify. You go to your qualification championships, you get your points, you hit your times, you're going to the Olympic Games. And what we found with Tokyo is suddenly it's another year. And that had a massive impact mentally on an awful lot of athletes, because your whole life is geared around the Olympic Games and building up to that event. And then suddenly it's another year. So everything is periodized, everything is strategized, everything is focused on, peaking when it really, really matters, and that's the Olympic Games. And unfortunately, and I'd say unfortunately, but also there was positives in it as well, because it gave our younger athletes another year, which when you look back at, say, Team Ireland that went out to Tokyo, we had a lot of young athletes going, which was fantastic because they had that extra year of development. But for, say, athletes who maybe are at towards the end of their careers, those twilight years, it was something very, very difficult because suddenly it all changes. And everything that they've geared up towards is gone like that. And I always talk about, where do people get their confidence from? And in my experience, and I've been fairly open about my kind of dealings with retirement and, that whole change of routine, structure, purpose, goals, it was something that I really struggled an awful lot with. And through my own kind of learnings and going to counselling and going back and getting a qualification in sports psychology and understanding how it all works, that river of confidence. And this is something that we can all kind of take something from, because I was challenged one time ago, okay, Dave, where'd you get your confidence from? And I was thinking, random question. But where do I get my self-worth, my self-esteem, my confidence, my belief, all this sort of, these words? And it came from one area of my life, and that was my athletics. So when I retired, and it would all change overnight, that river of confidence suddenly dried up. So I didn't know who I was. I didn't have a purpose. I didn't have a goal. I had no self-worth. Confidence began to decline. And that was a huge thing. We saw that quite a lot with a lot of athletes when it changed, because you have to change your whole year. So the routine changed, the structure changed, the goals changed. People got a little bit worried, anxious. Again, very similar to what we've had over the last 2 years. You know, you're simply, everything's changed overnight, personally and professionally. And that can cause a sense of, you know, you feel a little overwhelmed, you begin to worry. Straight away, you're thinking about what's going to be like in 2022, what's going to be like in 2023. Straight away, you idolize your past. I want things to go back to the way they were. And again, in my experience, that's exactly, I was never in the middle of the now. I was never focusing on going back to that 3 weeks, 1 week, 3 weeks, 1 week. It was literally straight away 5 years, 6 years down the line. And when you kind of look at, you know, the experience that Dara went through with that athlete, and we've had our own issues here in Ireland, again, with athletes who have retired and, you know, trying to deal with that, and it goes back to that change. And when I went back and I did a qualification in psychology, the lecturer put up the Kubler-Ross model. And I don't want to bore people with research here, but this kind of graph went up on the screen. And I remember looking at it going, there was words like frustration, denial, depression, and then there was, you come out of that little pit. And straight away, depression, and the other words were low mood, kind of sense of lethargy, so you didn't really want to do anything. And I could see exactly where I was at. And that was the Kubler-Ross change curve, and it originated from the grief curve. So when we lose something to us, you go through a set kind of series of emotions. Yeah. And it could take a week, it could take 10 years. And straight away I saw where I was. And it's now evolved into the change curve. It's now evolved as like the Kubler-Ross change curve or transition curve. And it was quite interesting because I think when we all look at the journey that we've been on over the last 2 years, both professionally and personally, we've probably all gone through those cycles. And that's where creating that support, that openness, and, you know, that culture where, you know, when we ask someone how they are, very Irish, I'm grand. You know, it's going a little bit deeper. It's actually trying to find out, you know, the issues that are maybe impacting the stressors and how that person actually feels. And, you know, that can be a challenge in itself. And I think, you know, when we look at sport and the pressures that come with it and the instant and the changes that can occur, because you mentioned 5 years, but now it's a 3-year cycle into Paris. So that has its own issues. You know, you've lost a year already. People are now already thinking of Paris and qualification and points. Whereas in previous years, if it was year one, you might have that nice, comfy little year. Yeah. But now it's straight on to the next one, and that in itself. So, you know, we're trying in the world of sport, and particularly, say, here in Ireland as well, is trying to get our athletes to look at where they get their confidence and self-worth from. You know, it can't just be from the sport, because sport is fragile. And I think we've kind of learned that life is fairly fragile over the last weeks, months, and even years, you know. And I think you have to look a little bit kind of broader than that and ask yourself, okay, well, where are those confidence, rivers of confidence, as I put it, and try and get that more kind of holistic approach to it. And that's really, really important. So even building up our athletes to kind of have careers outside of sport, you know. So what are your hobbies? Are you kind of improving self-development and all this sort of stuff as well is very, very important.
A river of confidence is an interesting word to describe it. And if I look at any river, it starts with a stream. And again, if we're talking to a leadership community here, an empty lantern offers no light. So again, it starts here, doesn't it, really? So what advice would you have, or how would you look at the lessons learned from what you've just described into what we're facing into now, as the oxygen masks have probably ran out by and large for a lot of our folks, and how we steer and how we lead and create the conditions for our people simply to be well?
It's a really poignant question, and I think we're still in a state of flux. I think things are constantly changing. For us all, you know, like we've gone through the pandemic, but now it's kind of that return to work. What does that look like? What does it look for individuals? You know, COVID issues, all this stuff is still very, very relevant. And I think it's having the understanding that what works for one person may not work for somebody else, and it's not individualized in every single case, but it's kind of having a culture where there's openness there. That if people are struggling or if people are finding the going tough, that they can talk, they have that confidence that they can open up and they'll be listened to. And I think what's really important is creating that culture by kind of peer-to-peer discussions. You know, it could be in-house discussions, and it takes us all to do that. You know, sometimes we look to the leader with the big title, but it can start from the ground. It can start from anybody to create that society or that kind of culture where it's okay to talk. You know, and this is something we've heard of before, but I suffered in silence for a number of years. Like, male stigma around mental health, you know, faster, fitter, stronger. I'm not going to show any weakness, you know, for the fear of how that was going to be perceived. But once I kind of, where I kind of got a lot of help was actually I heard another male sports person who had retired through injury. I heard him speak, and I actually thought, I'm not the only one. Someone else feels like this. And that gave me huge belief to actually put my hand up and get help and advice. And then you go on that journey. So, like, you know, as I described earlier on, it was kind of a case of like, I run, I'm back, I like running. A couple of years I hated it. I cycle, I try and look after myself. But I go to a mind gym, and that's my counsellor. That's the person I go and have a conversation with. And I think, you know, in kind of organisations, it's creating that environment where we can have conversations, we can have open dialogue, and nothing's off the table. And if you do speak, you're listened to. And I think that gives a lot of people confidence to speak out, but also an understanding to other people about what are the stressors for different people. And it's then trying to kind of come up with various kind of ways of supporting those individuals or collectively. And that's where I think with like wellness programs, long-term wellness programs, and, you know, making a calendar of events and trying to understand what people want. And that can be done by listening, which I think for me, talking, communicating that way was probably the most important thing in my journey.
Well said, David. And again, I know we're under a little bit of pressure time-wise. So I think from us, all of us, we would like to wish you well, and wish you great, and to once an Olympian, always an Olympian in my book, ladies and gentlemen. Please help me in thanking David Gillick.
Cheers. Thanks a lot. Nice
Thank you. Yeah.